introduce themselves. So Rebecca?
Hi, my name's Rebecca. I work in our participant learning division of AFS-USA. Basically what that means is I run orientations and different curriculum for all of our participants here at AFS-USA. And I'm going to pass it over to our friend and colleague Sarah Lindstrom to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Lindstrom. I'm a Spanish teacher in Glastonbury, Connecticut. I'm also a lead teacher there, and I work on intercultural competence in a lot of my curriculum, so I'm happy to be here to share some ideas with you.
Okay, so thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Sarah. So for those of you who might be new to AFS, we are an organization that works a lot with international student exchange, but we certainly take a lot of that information that we use with our students and with our host families to move that along and share those intercultural learning ideas and concepts on how to engage students in the classroom by sharing those with educators. So thank you for joining us tonight for just that. A quick introduction to our educational goals. We operate with the personal level of intercultural learning being the foundation for how we work with our lessons and what we share with both our students, our families, and our educators. Once students get to know who they are on a personal level, their ability to interact with each other on an interpersonal level is definitely much greater. And then, of course, as an international exchange organization, we want to fold in that cultural piece and hopefully encourage students and families to engage and educators in a global experience as well, to tie in all of those different pieces together. So our very first activity is one that we call the paper tear. And it is literally what it sounds like. You are going to be tearing a piece of paper. So our materials that you need to get started are going to be a piece of paper, okay? You're going to need the lesson plan, which we have provided. That is done for you. And if you're going to do this as a virtual activity or during virtual instruction, you might consider recording this piece that I'm about to do with you next, either on Flipgrid or on a recording program like Loom. I did not say Zoom, that is Loom with an L. And what you can do with that is just make a very simple recording. You could even do it with your phone if you didn't want to be on video. So you have lots of options there. But the idea is if you don't have your students live, this is an opportunity to record the next piece that we're about to do together. So to launch the lesson, I am literally going to launch this with you and say, go ahead and get out your piece of paper. And your goal in this activity is for you to produce an identical piece of paper by following, in this case, my live instructions. You would be doing this as a recording if you are not able to work with your students live. So from here, what I would like you to do is just listen and follow my instructions. So I'd like you to fold your piece of paper in half. I'd like you to tear off the bottom right corner of the paper. I'd like you to fold the paper in half again. And now I'd like you to tear off the upper right hand corner of the paper. And then I'd like you to fold the paper one more time and tear off the lower left-hand corner. And as you'll see, both Rebecca and Sarah, my co-presenters here this evening, have done this with me. So I'll go through those instructions one more time, okay, but I'm not gonna redo them, but that was fold your paper in half, tear off the bottom right-hand corner, fold the paper in half again, and then tear off the upper right-hand corner, and then fold that paper one last time and tear off the lower left-hand corner of the paper, okay? So Rebecca's gonna let you see what those instructions were so you can see them in writing. You have the choice as the teacher if you want to share those with your students or not. And then our next steps are going to be, like, now that you've all completed this activity and Rebecca and Sarah have done it with us, okay, I want everybody to unfold their piece of paper. And since I can't necessarily see all of you, Rebecca and Sarah are going to share the images of their papers. on the camera so we can see what they look like. Okay, so there are Rebecca and Sarah's images on their pieces of paper. Now let's remember the goal was for them to have an identical piece of paper as mine, and I did this at the same time as everybody. So here is my piece of paper that you can see, and theirs don't look like mine. So there is how we get to the intercultural part of this experience and why this lesson is related to this bigger title of critical listening. So they have revealed theirs, I have revealed mine, and what you can see is they don't match. So what we've done in our lesson plan is provided you with a series of discussion questions that you can use with your students to start processing what just happened in this activity. So what happened in the activity? How does yours compare to the teacher's? If you were to do this again, what might you do differently? And that's just a sampling of the discussion questions. So if you were me or Rebecca or Sarah in this situation, you might have been a little frustrated. Going, wait a minute, she told me to hold the paper and then she told me to tear off the bottom right-hand corner. Well, how do I know which one is the bottom right-hand corner? And that is part of the joy of this activity. It was very quick. It took us roughly 60 to 90 seconds to fold and tear, fold and tear, fold and tear. And so part of processing this activity with students is we've given you some of the notes to help them process in your discussion. And that's what we call discussion follow-up. So we've given you those notes in the lesson plan as well. So we don't expect you to be an expert on all things intercultural learning when you do this. So we've given you not only the prompting questions to get those reactions out of your students, but also the follow-up notes as well. And so, I've given you 2 of these. There are a lot more on the lesson plan, but, just some pieces for you in order to really do this activity well. We have to have a clear and shared vision of what the final goal is. And if you guys can't see what I'm aiming for as far as my paper image, my vision here, then it may be hard for you to get to the same place I am. And there's also this lack of two-way communication. And so I'm sure to some degree, if you start thinking about how this activity may relate to the circumstance that your students are in right now, this is a situation where when we move into remote instruction, they're sitting at home, you've sent out instructions for them, they may or may not be able to, or they may not feel that they can get the information that they need, even though we know that all of our educators are certainly happy to respond to their students, but not every student feels comfortable asking questions and so on. And if they can't see what other people around them are doing, it brings up that sense of isolation, and it's a good activity just to prompt some good discussion with your students, especially at this time right now. So we're going to show you very quickly some ideas on how you can apply this to other content areas and then process this a little more and move right on to our next activity. So if you're a language arts teacher, this can be a great lead-in to help students start thinking about different communication styles and how that affects them when they're doing writing, both in a narrative style and just everyday communication. If they were going to deliver a speech, any of those skills that come up in language arts, this is a great activity. So not only they think about how they are as the deliverer of the information in spoken language, but also in written language, and how it feels to be on the receiving end when there are details or a two-way communication style that's missing. If you wanted to do something like this in math, you could describe a geometric figure that students could draw or have them fold their piece of paper according to angle measurements that you provide. But they wouldn't be allowed to use any tools or anything like that, and see if you get them to the same place as what you folded or as what you described. In science, an extension of this, you could do it with the paper first or just scrap the paper and move right to this idea. Of course, you want to make sure that none of the steps or chemicals that you give the students would cause any poor reactions if you did this, but you could give them a very vague science experiment that they could do from home that wouldn't cause any harm. But it allows them to see that the end product of all of these are very different when the steps were not exact and they didn't have all of those details. Then if you were to move on to a world language classroom, Certainly you have the ability to do this activity in the target language, especially if you're working with the students learning commands or doing anything like that. It's a great warm-up for them. If you have ever heard of the show called Nailed It, it is a show on Netflix, and they actually have some episodes in Spanish that were filmed in Mexico as well. But this can be a great kind of, this is what the professional did, and this is what the amateur did in a limited time period. It can be a great lead in for that as a future listening activity for students. Family consumer sciences, much like science, give them a recipe that's very vague and see how the final products turn out differently. And for art, you could have students, use this activity, and you're just not very thorough when you're providing instructions, and they have to determine, does their perception, do their cultural values match when they're trying to interpret the things that you shared with them to move them forward. So why would you do this lesson, and why would you do it now? I think now definitely that piece about that sense of isolation and not being able to ask questions in the midst of being doing that activity in real time can certainly help you relate this lesson to what your students may be feeling like at home right now, and maybe a good chance to prompt discussion. And why would you do this lesson in general? We've tied it to a lot of content areas for you, but it's a very quick lesson and helps to illuminate to students the power of sharing detail and the power of just being a good communicator and asking questions when needed. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. She may have some additional points to add about this lesson, and she's going to take us straight to our next lesson.
I think that lesson is a great one to do right now as well. And our next lesson that I'm going to take you into is going to build off of the one that we just did. Very similar style of learning, but another way to kind of get this communication style and effective communication point across. So we will jump right in to what we're calling listen and draw. For anyone that might be familiar with this activity, it's also sometimes called back-to-back drawing. You will need that extra marker, pen, or paper that you were asked to get at the beginning. So please grab that other piece of paper, excuse me. Just like the last activity, the materials that you will need are the lesson plan that we're going to provide you. And you'll also need a paper and a marker for every student. The reason I'm suggesting marker, if you are doing this on a remote learning or virtual platform, it's a lot easier to see when the drawings or in this activity are big, bold, and beautiful when you hold it up than if it's super skinny and pen you can't really see. So I do suggest a marker. When you are launching the session, and we'll demonstrate as we did with the last activity quickly how this is done, you're going to want to ask every student to draw a picture. This can be something from your content area, so similarly a geometric figure, a beaker, different shapes, or it can be something as simple as a circle and a triangle overlapping, some pattern that comes straight from your students' minds. The idea is that the speaker will describe the drawing to someone else who is listed as the listener. If you're going to do this activity asynchronously, you can even have your students record these instructions or record their description of their picture they drew in advance, so that the other students who are serving as the listeners can come in and try to replicate that drawing using the instructions provided. Flipgrid and Zoom, this time we are saying Zoom with a Z, are good options if you want to explore doing this activity that way. The goal is that students do not show their picture to any listener at this point, because as in the last activity, the goal is for students who are the listeners to listen very intently and try to replicate what the speaker describes. So for our cases, I'm going to now serve as a student who's acting in the role of a speaker, and Jill is going to take her pen and paper and try to follow my instructions and act as a listener. And we're going to see if we can come up with the same drawing. So my first instruction is draw a rectangle in the bottom left corner of the page. Next, draw a diamond touching the top right corner. Then add a diagonal line left of the diamond. At the top of the diagonal line, draw a star. And the last one, draw a triangle touching the left side of the diagonal line.
It's not very pretty.
That's okay, that's okay. So before we jump into the discussion questions and kind of the larger conversation you're able to have, the intercultural conversation that comes from this activity, I want to see how we did. This is what I was asking Jill to draw. Jill, can you hold up yours? Okay, so not too bad, not too bad. Similar. The idea, again, is that we didn't match. I thought I was being clear, she was interpreting a different way. And that's where the discussion, again, comes into play here. You want to debrief this and kind of get students thinking about, as the speaker, how did it feel to describe an image but not to offer clarification, or not be able to see that someone is not quite doing what you expected them to do or what you meant? As the listener, how did it feel to do the task without being able to see somebody? In my case, I was able to see Jill kind of giggling to herself as she was drawing, but realistically, in virtual learning, we won't necessarily have that option, or your students won't be able to see each other, or for that matter, ask questions. My first instruction was draw a rectangle in the bottom left corner of the page, but I didn't say anything about size, right? I didn't give that extra layer of communication there. That might be a question that someone would want to ask, but in this case, they just can't. Again, it is that one-sided communication that listeners were unable to ask questions, get that feedback, and it really impacted our ability to succeed in the task, or in this case, match our drawings. There's a whole bunch more detail that I, as the speaker, could have put into it to get her to replicate it, and hopefully she could have asked questions in a real-life situation. The larger conversation is about communication styles. Our communication styles are developed, and they often are influenced by our family, our culture, our environment, all of these things that go into our upbringing, our personality. But regardless of one's communication style, communicating effectively requires that we use descriptive language, active listening skills, and we follow up for this clarification and understanding. And in the last activity, we took all of that away from you. With the descriptive language, sometimes it's even helpful, and your students may succeed using this type of language. I'm going to show the picture that I drew instead of going back to slides, but I could have said, put the star at the top of the diagonal line so it looks like a magic wand. Something that we're both familiar with would have made the instructions a little bit more clear. Many speakers, including myself, we tend to think that we're being clear, and if we're being clear, it's clear to everyone else. But that's not always the case. Instead of saying what we think the listener needs to know, it's challenging to kind of refocus and say, what does the listener need to know? What would help them understand what I want them to do, or what and sometimes more detail is more helpful. There's a couple ways to twist this activity, or offer variations rather. You could have your students watch multiple videos and attempt to recreate these drawings, again, for active listening practice. Flipgrid is another good tool for that. You could also have listeners and speakers swap roles so that each student gets a chance to experience both of those roles. And breakout rooms is a way that you could do that in the Zoom platform. If, for example, in our case, the picture wasn't correct and you have more time, you could also consider having students revise their instructions and try again. Once you debrief it, once you kind of give them the idea that they might need to add that descriptive language, try again, see if they can do it, get the drawings more closely to match the second time. And you also might consider implementing rules where the listener maybe can ask some clarifying questions. I've done this activity once where the listener was only allowed to ask one question. So they had to choose, at what point is this question, or which question do I ask is going to get me the most information or the most confirmation that I'm doing it correctly. And again, for another layer of complexity, you could also add some colors to the mix or shading, shapes. We didn't do that here today, but it is something that you could incorporate depending on your time and your grade level. Very similar to the last activity, this is also replicable in different content areas. Language arts, social studies, science, math. You can see all of that here. The science, again, you could do a short science experiment. Math, you could draw those geometric shapes or figures. Get your protractor out and make sure that you're saying very detailed instructions, a 39-degree angle, something like that. You can adapt these to your content areas. World languages as well. This could be done not only to learn the vocabulary in your target language, but also to practice kind of that internalization, that not having to translate in your brain a few times. Best for novice or intermediate, but I have done this in language learning myself as well. Family consumer sciences, very similar to the science example. You could give them a recipe. You could start with a drawing or jump straight to a recipe that maybe you don't specify whether you're supposed to use baking soda or baking powder. How many have ever made that mistake before? I have. It doesn't work very well. If they're not paying attention and they can't follow up with you to ask, wait, did you say soda or powder? And they guess, right? That's one that's not going to hurt anybody, but it's a good content-specific variation of this activity. And the same thing with art. Maybe you're studying a painter and you want to ask them to recreate one of the paintings you're studying, or maybe you want to do this activity in a medium that you're using, whether that's paint, crayons, ceramics, who knows. You can adapt that in that way as well. Why would you do this lesson now, and why would you do this lesson at all, and why would you do this lesson right now? Very similar to the last instruction, it is a lesson to elicit communication skills. It can be adapted content specific, but it also gets at this intercultural and this need to effectively communicate with people who are different from us. And I'm going to open it up to Jill and Sarah if you want to add anything before we pass it on to Sarah for the last activity.
Sure. Just one thing, since I've noticed we have a lot of language teachers in our audience this evening, is just a thought about the idea that this is something that helps students process that interpersonal relationship and the power of asking questions. If you've ever gotten kids started in their language learning process and they get very good at answering questions, but they need help processing how to ask questions, this is the type of activity where you can work them into like very basic, simplistic questions where they want to get the information to clarify a need that they have. So even before just general feel good gathering information, this is a need. I need to know how to get this piece of information to clarify this piece. So it can help them practice some of that interpersonal layer of the question asking and not just always answering. So on that note, Sarah is going to lead us to our next lesson, our third one.
Yes, and that's actually the perfect segue, because that's exactly what I really want to get to, is helping students learn how to ask those questions as part of their critical listening. So the lesson idea that I've come to share with you today is it's been out there. It's pretty simple, but it's a debate, and I use it in my class a lot, whether I have novice speakers or intermediate or even low advanced students. I think the debate really works well for language learning, and we'll apply it to a lot of disciplines at the end. So you'll see, as the other lessons share, we will connect it to a lot of disciplines. So basically, the first thing that you just need to find is a topic that is controversial. Easy enough, right? Within your content area, finding a topic that is controversial. And in a moment, I'll share the actual idea of one that I've just done with my classes. And in order to launch the lesson, be sure that you're sharing, giving input to their students. I mean, that's maybe a language term, but input works in any discipline. Just making sure that you're giving all sides a chance to be heard before the students actually start to dig into what side they'll defend, so that they have an idea of what all sides might be saying, and really so they know the topic. And I find it very helpful to capture early thoughts so that I can start to create teams with my students or groups with my students as I hear what side of the debate they tend to be on. It's usually easier if you can do groups that way. And the debate itself, I'm just always sure to share the expectations, and I will share those with you, the rules of the debate that I tend to use, and then the rubric. Having that be known beforehand is always helpful. And the groups, I like to create the groups, like I said, that have common interest in the topic, as far as the side of the topic goes, and then have them plan together. And the digital type of learning that we're doing right now has actually helped me modify some of what I do, and I'll share that with you. But it really is helping the students plan thoughtfully together before they actually do the debate orally. And I'll show some examples of that too. So here's the debate that I just did with my courses. I asked my students, should Puerto Rico become a state of the US? Should it remain a Commonwealth, or should it become an independent nation? And I started with doing a slideshow with Loom, actually, and I recorded my voice over slides and shared we had readings that we were doing before we left school about Puerto Rico that were just more basic historical Puerto Rico up until present day, just what it is as a Commonwealth and what that means. So pretty neutral, I would say. But then I continued that presentation and then gave them articles to read on their own that presented evidence, you could say, or arguments for each side, whether, it could be a strong nation, whether it should stay a Commonwealth, or whether it would be good as a state. Sharing, things about how Puerto Rico does vote for that, etc. And then I had a preliminary conversation with my students. I was lucky enough to get most of my students on a few calls throughout the week, and I had them share just some thoughts about the articles that they had been reading. And I was sort of just taking notes, and I had color-coded groups that I was starting to make. And if students weren't sure, that was helpful too, because then I could put the groups where they needed to go, put the students where they needed to go to make the even groups. And you can also just do that if you don't get to have conversations, but have that on Google Classroom, or if you have a place where students are having online conversations or making comments, they can do it that way too, or even just give you feedback through email. So my debate has groups planning in a Google Doc, and I have a screenshot I took for you of one of my group's works to what they were doing to plan as a group the different places that they would be arguing about, the different topics within their main point that they would be arguing about. And they're all assigned a time when you have to do it this way. I was making Google Meets with all my classes, so they had to go and sign up for a time. This is the rubric. It's small to see, but if you Google Glastonbury Public Schools and rubrics, this will come up, but it will also share it with you. But if you want to go to the next slide, I just pulled a piece from this rubric that I think is the key to the debate part and just the critical listening part also. The conversational skills row at the bottom of our rubric, I think, is really helpful when we're trying to really increase our students' ability to listen critically. And you'll see here that we're asking students to use questioning strategies that really elicit answers and that are complex and that really go deeper into the topic rather than just a superficial question. It shows that students are curious, and that's a big piece of global competence, is having that curiosity toward another person. And so those are the big pieces that I really encourage students to demonstrate in any interpersonal task, but really in a debate. This piece of the rubric is a huge part of their grade. I say all the time that you cannot get beyond, you cannot move up this spectrum of limited to mastery without truly mastering the ability to ask critical questions. And the debate is a great place to showcase that. So this is the example of the rules I share. I feel like you can make the rules. There's plenty of examples online of debate rules, but you make the rules for what fit best for you. This is probably helpful for you if you truly are going to do a debate in your classroom. But if we go to the next slide, I think it'll be easier for me to explain what it looks like once I give the rules. The group, there's two groups usually. In this case, there were some groups that had some bigger conversational debate groups that had three, each side, but a lot of the time I just had the two sides. And in general, I have two sides of the debate. So both do their introduction, then the first group that went for the introduction is going to be the first group that goes for point one, and then the other group will have a counterpoint, and then the first group who made the point always gets to finish the point. So that way it makes it fair for all of the research that they've done. They get to have the last word on the point that they researched. And then that goes back and forth pretty simply until every group is done. You might want to put a time limit. It depends how long you have. It depends how long you want to give students, because some students can talk for 20 minutes on one of these points, whereas some will talk for 30 seconds and not want to say anything else. So you might, I'd like to do a 1 minute actual time limit for the point, and then the counterpoint, and then the defense. So 1 minute each. So it could be up to a 3 minute piece. And then the conclusion comes down to who spoke the least, or does everyone want to talk and have the last word on their points that they didn't get to have that last word on. So that's how I do it, and it's worked really well over the years. Just scaffolding as needed. If it's novice learners, giving them the vocab ahead of time, really framing it in tables for them. You know, this is the good of the argument we're going to have, and this is the bad of it. And now you're going to pull together an argument of the side that you're on. And so some examples of what it's been looking like for me now. We actually had a debate happen in class right before everyone went home. And that debate was a different topic, but there was only one group left because I wasn't sticking to my 1 minute rule. They didn't get to finish the debate in class. So we actually had to do it as a Google Doc. I made a table, and the students debated back and forth on a Google Doc, which I was really surprised at how well they did and how well they were able to really communicate what they wanted to communicate on write, you know, interpersonal writing. I hadn't really done anything like that before. So that was impressive. But ideally it'll be oral. I think that's the best way to do a debate, and you really get to hear the students asking those questions, and you can even encourage them if you're able to do it live. And so that's what I did with the synchronous learning. We did the Google Meet. I've been doing Google Meet with my students, and fortunately most students were able to come to that debate and do it. The students who didn't, though, actually did the option one. They recorded themselves as sort of a makeup and sent it to me. So some did a Zoom recorded, or some just took a video of their conversation that they were having on the phone. Well, you know, visually on the phone. So that's been interesting to see, but students have so far done well, whether we're together or not. But then the hybrid method was, like I mentioned before, having them really plan and work on that Google Doc, and paying close attention as their teacher to help them, to give them new questions that they maybe weren't considering. And to, you know, make sure each member of the group is participating equally and adding to their argument and getting ready to defend their argument. That part was, I thought, helpful for them to prepare, and it was also helpful for me to have the time to really go in and encourage them to look a little further into the topic, or, you know, maybe pose a question that I knew the other group would bring up. And for me, Google Classroom has been a great spot to house all those documents and to go back in and see which groups I had responded to or not, and for them to chat with me a little bit more and to plan for the meet itself. So these are the samples I told you I provide. Again, they're small, but I really just wanted to show you the format that they're in. So the one on the left is the planning document. And I had the students, they divided the argument for whatever side they were on into political, economic, and cultural reasons that they believed what they believed, or that whatever they researched told them. So the color code is for the topic, if it's political, economic, or cultural. And then students wrote their names next to the topic that was theirs. And these were groups of 3, so it wasn't too overwhelming. And then the one on the right was that debate. It was about Cuba instead of Puerto Rico. And that was the one that they did because they didn't get to finish in class. And it was, again, they color coded on their own. I didn't tell them they had to. I just told them to write their name after, so I could see who was writing and who was responding to who. And because they had already planned with that Google Doc of the table that you see on the left, a version of that, they knew who was going to do the introduction. They knew who had what point. And then after they saw what everyone wrote, the conclusion was with members of the group who wanted to have something to do with the conclusion. So that's it for, that I wanted to share with you on that specific example. But I think debate is something that's so easily applicable to so many other subject areas. And these were just, we were thinking of some that might fit into any other classroom, but like, who is the villain of Romeo and Juliet? And in world language, you could ask other questions like, is a dress code better or worse for public schools? For social studies, something like, was the colonization of America positive or negative? For math, should the US move to the metric system? For science, what is the best source of renewable energy? For a career in tech ed, should CTE be a required subject area in high school? And physical education, should gender play a role in the sports we play? I mean, they're endless. You can think of so many things that really apply to what you're already teaching and the content that you already teach, but it's really a great way to get kids invested in their learning. They get to have a say in what they think is happening. And, you know, considering what the world is like right now, to get kids invested in whether Puerto Rico should be a state or not was, I thought, going to be tough. But because they had teams and because they were working, you know, to win something, I think it really encourages students to be involved and to really work on, even in my sake as a language teacher, to get the language down so that they're being a strong member of the team to say what they need to say and to ask the questions they need to ask to get that grade as far as the critical listening part goes.
Okay, so why would we do this lesson, and why would we do this lesson now?
Well, I guess I already kind of said that, but I really do think it's a great way to pull kids in at a time when they might not have the chance to be as invested, or not that the chance, but they might just be, you know, overwhelmed with so much other information that's in their heads. I think this is a good way to pull students in and to get them engaged in their learning again. And hopefully, if it's a topic that is somehow applicable to their lives too, that would help. I'm hoping for my final one of the year to be a little bit more, you know, less content driven and more, you know, how does language affect me and how am I going to use it in the future? So thinking about how you can connect it to your students even further, I think, is a way to make debate meaningful for your students.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So I think what hopefully everyone was able to take away from this trio of lessons tonight was just not only do they all kind of flow together. You know, all three of these lessons were put together in this webinar to build on one another, to show how, you know, how it can feel if you can't ask questions and you can't be part of that two-way communication. And the next one is, well, what happens if in that two-way communication or limited communication, you don't get a lot of detail or not enough to perceive what you really need to take care of. And then Sarah really was able to bring it home and share with everyone the importance of having to listen and really listen well to what the other students on the other side of the argument have to say in the debate, so that these students' responses are applicable. So thank you for joining us for all of those. You'll see on our next slide here, we did mention quite a few little tech apps and different things throughout the webinar tonight. So if you have questions about any of those, let us know. But lots of the aspects of Google, the Google Suite, are very applicable. Flipgrid and Loom are definitely mechanisms, and Zoom, for synchronous or asynchronous video recording and so on. And then you can see hopefully we met our goals for this evening in a lot of different ways. You were able to network, you were able to, we have teachers joining us tonight from the Philippines, from all over the United States, from lots of different content areas. So hopefully these allowed you to see how they would be applicable to the content area that you teach. And hopefully you might have made some connections with other individuals who teach the same content, so you can build some of those bridges either across the country or across the pond, as they may say, depending where you're from. So we're going to open it up for questions. Some of you have already asked some questions that we've answered in the Q&A box, also in the chat box. We're happy to stay and answer any more of those. But we would like to remind you that there is one more webinar in this series that is coming up next week. It is our kind of summation webinar of all of the ones that we've done in this shorter series. And it's called From Cartoons to Classics. And we're gonna teach you how to use movie clips, and we'll probably talk about Edpuzzle as well, and how to use these movie clips and things that kids are seeing on television, because there's a lot of TV time right now during remote instruction, and how to pull the intercultural nature out of those TV shows, cartoons, whatever it is. And we're going to apply this to a variety of age groups. So elementary teachers, middle school teachers, high school teachers, you're all welcome to join us next week for our final webinar. And if you are part of our educator network, hopefully you received the information on this next slide, where we are inviting you to let us do a little bit of the live instruction for you. if your kids can attend a live webinar for about 30 minutes with us, our partners around the world are joining us to share some content for students. So most of them are in English, but we do have 2 that are in Spanish, 1 that'll be delivered in Portuguese, and 1 that'll be delivered in French. And so you are welcome. We've set it up so that you can send the passport directly to your students as a PDF. And after they attend any one of these webinars, again, these are live, so they will be very, very interactive and very interesting with our partners. But after the students attend, and you're welcome to attend, of course, we will send all of you a stamp for your AFS passport to New Perspectives. So if you would like this will come out to you tomorrow when I do send up the follow email with the lesson plans, the links to all of these cultural presentations. You are welcome to share them with your students. They are not filled up yet, so there are still time for your students to join us, whether it's an English presentation about one of the cultures. And each one of these will talk about home and family, school and education, health, wellness, and food, art and culture, and even global challenges. So if you have kids preparing for their AP tests or anything like that, and they want to learn about some global challenges in Chile or Spain or any other country around the world, great for kids who participate in Model UN. Join us for at least one of these, and we'll send you a stamp for your AFS passport.